The 2018 Commonwealth Innovation Forum, brought to you by Destination Gold Coast.
Thank you. And to move straight on, I talked about our next guest, Lord Marland of Odstock, and he is here to talk to us this afternoon. We'll look at renewable and sustainable products and practices. Please give him a really big Aussie welcome. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Very good to see you. I'm slightly disappointed to be here. I've been sitting on the beach a little bit earlier today. I'm in a very relaxed Aussie mood, having been watching the games and spending my Easter on the Gold Coast. So I'm not really up to speed with performing in front of great audience and respected audience like yourselves. Of course, you know, the usual thing you get here, and Mario says to me, "Oh, Christ, mate, we've just had the most brilliant speaker, Matthew Ames. He's absolutely the best speaker I've ever heard of. A Prime Minister of Malta, he was absolutely marvellous, really good guy." Sorry about the Australian accent for those that... and then we had the Australian 2017 Australian of the Year, Professor Alan Mackay-Sim before you, and I think you sort of think, oh shit, this is awful, isn't it? I've got to get on at 2:30 where most of you are half asleep, having had a very substantial lunch with a few drinks, no doubt, tell you about something that for a lot of people, you know, is slightly altruistic, and something actually I haven't spoken on seriously for a couple of years. And what and most of you are thinking, what the hell's his qualification for standing up and talking about, what is it, renewables and sustainable products, and performing in front of you? Well, you know, I may be chairman of the Commonwealth Enterprise Investment Council, but I was, believe it or not, minister in the British government for energy and, wait for it, climate change. So there, she didn't tell you about that. So I know a little bit about the subject matter involved. And on a serious note, this is clearly one of the key subjects that is on most people's mind. It's something that will be a key issue for us in London, where we will be having the Commonwealth Business Forum. I imagine the Commonwealth Business Forum, where we will have 35 heads of government, 3 members of the royal family. Is it 3 only? 3, I think, at the moment. Prince of Wales, Prince William, Duke of York, where we'll have the Lord Mayor of London, the Mayor of London, the Prime Minister of the UK, Prime Minister of Malta, Bill Gates, 20 billionaires, and that excludes Mario, 10 multi-billionaires, and of course Bill Gates goes into a slightly stratosphere altogether, all gathered together under 3 roofs, actually, because we can't fit them all into one, for a convention for 2.5 days. Imagine what an enabling event that is. And almost the key person, the sexy person everyone wants to know, is someone a lot of you in this room won't have heard of. But when you Google him and see his credentials after this event, I mean, you can Google him now because it'll be more interesting than listening to me, but you can Google him, a man called Lewis Pugh. Anyone heard of Lewis Pugh in this room? See, listen, none of you. Well, Lewis Pugh is a swimmer, and he started life partly in the UK, partly in South Africa. He trained to be a lawyer, then decided he wanted to join the SAS, which is the Special Armed Forces in the United Kingdom, and really decided in the end that his real message was that he wanted to save the seas. And the only way that he could save the seas was to demonstrate himself swimming in various seas in the world, which is not an unremarkable thing, you know, popping backwards and forwards to Robben Island. Virtually few people do it alive. He's done it alive more times than you care to remember. But I think the greatest thing he ever did was swimming 1 kilometre in the North Pole, right at the top of the North Pole, 1 kilometre in just a pair of Speedos. Remarkable achievement. No one has obviously ever done it before. He's UN ambassador for the seas, and the oceans. He's worked with the Australian, Russian, even the Russian government. Not many people are doing that now. To transform attitudes to fishing, particularly down in Antarctica. And his whole ethos in life, by the way, and it's worth remembering, is that you have to kill the bad wolves in your mind in order to conquer anything. And I think that is just a remarkable thing. So when I get on the plane tonight, any bad wolves or fears I might have flying, which I don't, by the way, luckily, but some of you do, conquer those bad wolves, and it's such a great thing. But anyway, he is going to be one of our key speakers there, and what a powerful and charismatic man he is, and do by all means Google him. He's also incredibly good looking, which is very annoying, and a very good speaker, which is equally annoying. So when I became this incredible minister, of which, by the way, I knew so little about. I'd been in business all my life. The Prime Minister asked me actually really to come in and do energy, but I obviously had the title of climate change attached to it. It wasn't, on the face of it, I was going to be the junior minister there. But unfortunately, my Secretary of State was being arrested by the police for giving 3 points on his driving license to his wife and not declaring it so that he wasn't banned from driving. So his final words to me was, I've got trouble at home, and had quite a lot of trouble at home, as it turns out. It wasn't just the driving. I've got trouble at home, you run the department. So in literally about 3 weeks, I had to do this university degree on global warming, global sciences, sustainability, what was going to be the future. And I know I'm happily in Australia, so I can speak openly and frankly in front of this audience. And I know it's not, it is being televised, so I'll even speak more frankly because I like these things to be televised. But I came to the conclusion with all this stuff coming at me that I obviously knew nothing about the science, and I was never going to know anything about the science because it was so complicated. And every time you thought you understood the science, another scientist would say, actually, the world isn't warming. It's getting colder, and then someone would say that. So I took the view that I was going to stand away from the science and try and understand what it was going to be like from the consumer's point of view on the one hand, what it was going to be like for the next generation on the other hand in terms of attitudes. And on that subject, by the way, of attitudes, I think I'm from a totally different generation, obviously, than my children's generation. But if you were to say to them, what are the 2 or 3 most important things in your life? They would say the world, the sustainability of it, etc. And of course, when I was a child, and most of you in this room are far younger than me, that wouldn't have been anywhere near our top 10, would it? It wouldn't have occurred to us. But now it is so important in terms of the attitude of that generation. And they want to see politicians and businesses operating in a sustainable and ethical and much more scientifically based approach to how we cope with these changes that are going on in our world. So attitude was a very important thing. Consumer was an equally important thing, because in the end, what is the cost to the consumer of any steps that we take? When I got into government, we were on the back of COP 2020, which was a decision by a lot of the leading governments to reduce our carbon footprint by 20%. And it was interesting to see how many governments went about it. Some thought it would just happen by chance. Others subscribed to the agreement but did nothing about it. Clearly, America and China hadn't subscribed to it at that point. But the UK became zealous about it and overzealous about it. And so we had a totally chaotic subsidy system that was created, and this isn't a political point, but it was a Labour government, because they determined that we had to achieve this figure irrespective of the cost. And so the first thing they set about was solar power. We've got to give massive subsidies to solar power. Anyone been to the UK, by the way? Anyone seen the sun in the United Kingdom of late? Someone has seen the sun in the United Kingdom. And here we were committing this subsidy for solar power. And the subsidy, by the way, was 10 billion for a 500 million net present value. I inherited that mess. The UK taxpayer is paying the bill for now rows and rows of solar panels that are across our green and pleasant land, in one cases, and are switched on in others. Now, I've been to Australia recently, and I've seen you get the sun occasionally, and in fact, I would totally applaud a subsidy for solar panels here. It is absolutely mad that you don't, but in the United Kingdom, it's a totally different thing. They then set about building wind farms across all our great hills and countryside, etc. 25 billion subsidy, net present value 2.5 billion. Who pays for that? The consumer. Okay, we do get wind, but you have to value it against whether you protect your countryside, your green and pleasant land, against building a sustainable wind power system which will generate roughly about 10% of our electricity. And on a good year, when it really is windy, when we get typhoons coming through, it's about 25%. And then the subsidies went on. So I found that we had this incredible cost to the taxpayer that was going to come down the road to us. So reluctantly, and actually it wasn't reluctantly, I stopped it immediately. And the only thing I couldn't stop was the wind power one, because even our Secretary of State said we've got to have one subsidy in place for it. But the cost on the consumer's electricity bill now is real pain. And that is where I caution deliverables in this particular area from experience. Full approval for applying the technology towards the climate as it exists. We should tailor the subsidies to fit the real benefit, and that is my attitude toward. My other attitude was one of good housekeeping, and that, I think, really goes to the heart of attitudes and the next generation, and is where that wonderful blend about protecting the consumer but also protecting the environment. And that is largely done through education. And I'm glad to see that in Australia and through a lot of countries, we have 3 waste paper baskets that we can put stuff into. We can recycle, we can convert that waste to energy. We can, and those that can't gets the treatment gets put in to attend to it. And I think that's where our future lies, because it ticks the right boxes. And so there we channeled our subsidies in the United Kingdom to affecting those particular areas. But it really can be only done through education. Having just been through many of the Commonwealth countries of late, there are countries which have no intention of considering how they best cope with this as a problem going forward. Litter all over the place, piles of it, continuing the old stuff. And we have to educate those countries through nudge and through subsidy and aid in order for them to help it. So what then were the key drivers to what we could do apart from that? Clearly, good housekeeping meant not putting carbon dioxide into the air. And that's why the real pressure from 2020 went on to the motor car industries, because that was our biggest issue. and we forced the motor car industries into cleaner fuels, cleaner use of fuels, and as I think, despite the lies that a number have told, that on the whole has been successful and has had a dramatic approach on our footprint. And as a net result, going back to the UK again, we will have reduced our carbon footprint by 20% by 2020, despite removing these subsidies and putting the pressure back onto it. We should not, of course, forget that the world will not survive on just renewables and the practice of it. It will continue to need coal, which is good for Australia. It will continue to need gas, which is a clean and very efficient form of supply. And it will only be one part of the constituency that forms our energy supply, which is going, as you can understand, exponentially up. So we mustn't be hair-shirted about all this. We have to be sensible and realistic about how we support the consumer in an ever-increasing world. To finish, and I'm very happy to have questions. I don't know how much time I've got. I am finishing now. As an anecdote, one of the other things I did was I was responsible for getting, in year one, we got into government, a 10% reduction of carbon footprint within all the UK government buildings. That included our defence, etc., etc. Obviously, this was quite a big challenge because it had to happen within 12 months. And during that period, the Minister for Government Buildings in China came to see me and he said, you know, explain to me how you're doing this. I said, well, it's quite simple. We've given instructions. Everyone's got to pursue those instructions within their own way. And, you know, we'll do an audit after 6 months to see how they're getting on. And then if they're not getting on as well, we're going to come on them like a ton of bricks and send the, you know, the climate change police in. And he said, this is such a brilliant idea. I'm going to go back and do this in China. And do you know what? He went back, put that law in within almost days, and a year later, they had reduced their carbon footprint within government buildings in China by 10%. And that shows you how quickly China can move when it wants to. But that isn't the end of the story. As we got to the week before our 10% reduction had to happen, everything was looking rosy across the path except for one building that had not achieved its 10% reduction. And that, of course, was number 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister, for those that don't know, lives. So he had to go without heating and electricity for a week in order to satisfy that criteria. And with that, thank you very much indeed for listening, and good luck to you all.
Thank you, Lord Marland. And what a great story to end. And I almost missed my cue. I was actually out Googling Lewis Pugh.
Oh, well done.
And for the Aussies in the room, he's an Edmund Hillary of swimming and has done some amazing stuff. Now, this is called a Queensland drover's hat. And I just looked up the temperature in London. So
what is it?
6 degrees. So it's 28 degrees outside, 6 degrees in London. I'm thinking it might keep your ears warm rather than protect you from the sun. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Lord Marland of Odstock. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.